The laugh wasn't loud. That was the part Dale Mossberger remembered most clearly, 30 years later. Not a big laugh. Not the kind of laugh that fills a room and embarrasses everyone in it. Just a short, quiet, confident laugh, the kind a man makes when someone has said something so obviously wrong that a full response isn't worth the effort. The kind of laugh that says, "I've seen this before. I know how it ends. I don't even need to argue." Dale heard it and said nothing. He paid for his parts, walked out to his truck, and drove the 14 miles home to his farm in Auglaize County, Ohio. He did not go back to that dealership for 22 years. Part 1. The Farm and the Man Dale. Mossberger was 41 years old in 1974 and had been farming the same 118 acres in Auglaize County his entire adult life. He'd inherited the ground from his father in 1962, who'd inherited it from his father before that, and the Mossberger family had been on that specific piece of Ohio ground since 1891. 4 generations, same land, same general approach to farming it. Deliberate, conservative, attentive to debt, skeptical of anything that required a payment book. The farm was not large. By the standards of 1974, when the consolidation of American agriculture was accelerating and the conventional wisdom was that you had to get big or get out, 118 acres was a small farm. Dale knew this. He had no illusions about the size of his operation relative to the direction things were going. What he had instead was a clear-eyed assessment of what his 118 acres could support, what debt load his operation could carry without becoming dangerous, and what machinery made sense for the work he actually had to do. The machinery question was where things got interesting. Dale ran Farmalls, had always run Farmalls, going back to his grandfather's first tractor in 1936. There was a 1950 Farmall M in his barn that had been there since his father bought it new and that Dale had maintained with the same care his father had shown it. There was a 1963 Farmall 560 that he'd bought used in 1968, reconditioned over a winter, and put to work on the heavier field jobs. And there was a 1955 Farmall 300 that handled the lighter work, cultivation, the garden tractor duties, the miscellaneous jobs that a working farm generates continuously. 3 tractors, all Farmall. All paid for. None of them with a payment due to anyone. His neighbors, by 1974, had largely moved on. The consolidation pressure had pushed them into larger machines. John Deere 4020s and 4230s, IH 1066 and 1086, equipment with more horsepower and more capability and substantially more monthly payment obligation. The county had 4 John Deere dealerships by then. International Harvester had 2. There was 1 White dealer and 1 Alice Chalmers dealer covering the area. There was no longer a Farmall dealer in the useful sense. International Harvester still sold under the Farmall brand through IH dealers, but the classic Farmall model line had been transitioning to the IH numbered series since the late 60s, and the old Farmall models Dale ran were now officially vintage equipment in the service department's estimation. Parts existed. Service knowledge was fading. This was the context when Dale walked into the John Deere dealership in Wapakoneta in the fall of 1974. Part 2. The conversation at the counter. He had gone to buy parts. Specifically, he needed a hydraulic fitting for the 560 and a set of points for the M, and his usual supplier, an IH dealer in Delphos, was back-ordered on both. He'd driven past the Wapakoneta Deere dealership 100 times. He knew they had a large parts department. He went in on a Tuesday morning. The parts counter was staffed by a man named, according to the name tag on his green vest, Kessler. He was in his late 30s, clean-shaven, the kind of dealership employee who had been in the business long enough to know the product thoroughly and to have developed, alongside that knowledge, a settled confidence in the superiority of what he sold. Dale gave him the part numbers for the hydraulic fitting, cross-referenced from his IH service manual, since the fitting was a standard SAE specification that would be available from multiple manufacturers. Kessler found it quickly and efficiently. The M points he couldn't help with. Those were a Farmall part, and Kessler had no reason to stock them. Dale expected that. While Kessler was pulling the hydraulic fitting, he made conversation in the way that dealership parts men make conversation. Lightly, professionally, with an undertone of brand loyalty that was part of the job. He asked what Dale was running. Dale told him. 3 Farmalls, an M, a 560, and a 300. Kessler absorbed this. He was not rude about it. He wasn't the kind of man who was rude directly. But he said, with the particular gentle certainty of a man who knows things, that he'd seen a lot of those older IH machines come through the service department over the past few years with parts problems. The 560 hydraulic system especially, known for issues, he said. Difficult to get parts for the older configurations. The M was getting to the age where sourcing was going to become a real challenge. He said all of this helpfully, the way a doctor mentions a risk factor, not to alarm, just to inform. Then he said, if you're thinking about updating, we've got some excellent financing on the 4230 right now. 122 horsepower, comes with a cab. You could trade all 3 of those in and come out with one machine that does the work of all 3, probably for less than you think. Dale thought about that for a moment. Then he said, I've got 3 tractors and no payments. The 4230 would put me in payments for how long? Kessler ran the numbers. 7 years at the current rate, with trade-in credit for the 3 Farmalls. Dale said, so I'd trade 3 paid-for machines that I can fix myself for 1 machine with 7 years of payments that goes back to the dealer when something needs the computer looked at. Kessler said, diplomatically, that the 4230 was a very reliable machine and that the dealership's service department was excellent. Dale said he didn't doubt either of those things. He took the hydraulic fitting, paid for it, thanked Kessler, and walked toward the door. That was where the laugh happened. Not at Dale. Kessler was too professional for that. But as Dale reached the door, he could hear from the back of the parts counter the sound of Kessler saying something to a colleague that Dale couldn't quite make out, followed by the short, quiet laugh. The laugh of a man who has just watched someone make an obvious mistake and is not surprised by it. Dale pushed through the door and walked to his truck. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. He was not angry. Anger was not particularly in his nature. He was thoughtful. He ran the numbers in his head the way he always ran numbers. What would the 4230 actually cost him, all in, over 7 years, against what he was actually spending on the 3 Farmalls annually? He'd done this calculation before, and the conclusion hadn't changed. The Farmalls were cheaper to own than anything with a payment book attached to it, even accounting for parts and service costs. He started the truck and drove home. Part 3. What he did instead. What Dale did instead of buying the 4230 was continue doing what he'd been doing, which was maintaining the 3 Farmalls with the careful attention they'd received his entire farming life. The M went through a valve job in 1975. He did it himself, over 2 weekends in February when the weather kept him out of the fields, using a service manual he'd had since the early 60s, and parts he ordered from a supplier in Fort Wayne who specialized in older IH equipment. Total cost, $68 in parts plus his labor. The 560 he pulled the hydraulic system on in 1977, when the pump showed signs of wear that he'd been tracking for 2 seasons. He replaced the pump and the pressure relief valve and flushed the system, and it ran correctly for another decade after that. Total parts cost, $112. The 300 needed almost nothing. It was the lightest duty machine in his fleet, and it responded to light duty use by requiring light maintenance. He replaced the carb in 1979, a job he did in an afternoon. His total equipment maintenance expenditure for the period 1974 through 1982, 8 years, was something he tracked with the same precision he tracked everything on the farm, in the columnar notebooks he kept in the farm office. He tallied it in 1983, curious. 8 years of maintenance on 3 tractors, including parts, fluids, a replacement tire on the M's left rear, and the miscellaneous supplies that accumulate in any honest equipment account. $483. He thought about what 7 years of payments on a 4230 would have come to. The comparison was not subtle. Part 4. The farm grows. Anyway, there is a common assumption in farming communities, in many communities, that growth is the evidence of good decisions. The operation that gets bigger is the one that made the right calls. The farm that adds acres is the farm that got it right. Dale Mossberger's farm grew in the years after 1974, not because he was aggressive about expansion, but because the combination of no equipment debt and careful management of operating costs left him with margin, Actual, real margin, the kind that accumulates in a farm account and makes opportunities possible when they appear. In 1976, he bought 40 acres from a neighbor who was having trouble meeting his equipment notes. He paid cash. Not because he was wealthy, he was not wealthy, but because he had cash. The cash came from the gap between what his operation cost and what it earned, and that gap had been maintained by the decision, made every year, to run paid-for equipment rather than financed equipment. In 1979, he added another 22 acres, again for cash, from an estate sale 2 miles down the road. 180 acres now. Still no equipment debt. The 3 farmalls were still running. His neighbors watched this with the mixed reaction that communities give to people who succeed by doing the thing the community consensus said was wrong. There was acknowledgement. Yes, Dale had done well. Nobody disputed that. There was a certain recalibration of how his choices were described in retrospect. The paid-for farmals that had been the subject of Kessler's laugh in 1974 were now described by the same community as solid old iron that Dale knew how to keep running, which was true but was also a revision of the original assessment. What nobody said out loud, but what several of Dale's neighbors understood privately, was that 2 or 3 of the farms that had bought 40-20s and 42-30s and similar machines on 7-year notes in the 1970s had not fared as well. The farm crisis of the early 1980s hit Auglaize County the way it hit every farming county in the Midwest. Hard, suddenly, in the particular way that crises hit operations that are carrying debt when the prices fall and the interest rates rise. Dale watched farms around him go through serious distress in 1982, 1983, and 1984. He watched equipment get repossessed and land get sold under pressure, and men he'd known his whole life make the calls to their bankers that nobody wants to make. He was not immune to the pressure of low crop prices. No farmer was. But his cost structure was different from his neighbors, and the difference was large enough to matter. He didn't have equipment notes. The payment that would have been the 42-30 note, 7 years, remember, which would have run through 1981, was not in his expense column. It had never been there. He farmed through the early 80s without losing ground. Part 5. The second generation of farmalls. By 1985, Dale was 52 years old and farming just over 200 acres. The original 3 farmalls were still in the barn, still working, though their roles had evolved. The M had been retired from field work to lighter duties, running the PTO on the grain auger, moving equipment around the yard, the miscellaneous work that a farm needs done without putting hours on the primary field machines. The 560 was still in regular field use. The 300 was still doing what it had always done. He added to the fleet in 1985 with a purchase that would have had Kessler's successor at the Wapakoneta dealership, reaching for the same expression Kessler had reached for in 1974. He bought a 1967 Farmall 1206 diesel. The 1206 was the large-frame IH machine of the mid to late 60s, a genuine 100-horsepower tractor in an era when that was serious power. The kind of machine that gave IH a foothold in the market segment that had been trending toward larger equipment throughout the 60s. It had been a competitive machine when new. By 1985, it was 18 years old, and the collector market for old IH iron hadn't yet developed to the point where it affected the prices of working machines at farm sales. He paid $900 for it at a dispersal sale near Salina. It had been well maintained by the previous owner, a farmer who had retired and was selling everything, and it ran correctly. The engine was tight, the hydraulics worked, the transmission was sound. $900. Cash. He used the 1206 for the primary field work, primary tillage, planting, and moved the 560 down to a secondary role alongside the M. He now had 4 tractors. None of them had a payment attached. The combined purchase cost of his entire fleet, from the M his father had bought new in 1950 through the 1206 he'd just acquired, was traceable in his columnar notebooks. He'd never paid more than $900 for any single machine. His total fleet investment over 35 years of farming, under $5,000, including the original cost of the M when his father bought it new. Part 6. The day he drove past the dealership. In 1988, Dale drove past the Wapakoneta John Deere dealership on his way to the elevator. He'd driven past it hundreds of times in the 14 years since the laugh at the parts counter. He noticed, this particular morning, that the lot was different than usual. Smaller. The lineup of new equipment that normally occupied the front of the lot was reduced. There was a sign in the window that he couldn't read clearly as he drove past. He stopped at the elevator, unloaded his grain, and on the way back he slowed down and looked at the dealership. The sign said the service department was closing. He pulled in. The dealership was not going out of business entirely. The parts counter was staying open, he was told by the young man behind the desk, a different young man from Kessler, who apparently had moved on years before. But the service department was closing, and with it the service contract relationships that had been the primary reason many of the area's larger operations had bought from this dealership. The economics hadn't worked out. Dale asked about Kessler. The young man didn't know who he meant. He'd been there 3 years. Dale bought a quart of hydraulic fluid and left. He sat in his truck for a moment in the dealership parking lot, the same truck he'd sat in 14 years before, though a different model by then. He looked at the reduced equipment lot and the sign about the service department and thought about the laugh and the 7-year note and the 4230 that he had declined to buy. He thought, I did not make the right decision because I knew the dealership would have service problems 14 years later. I made the right decision because the numbers were right. The rest of it is coincidence. He drove home. He told Loretta, his wife, who had been hearing the Kessler story for 14 years, what he'd found. Loretta said, She had long since reached her own conclusions about the decision and didn't need to revise them. Part 7. The Farmalls at 40 years. In 1990, the M turned 40 years old. Dale had a habit of marking equipment anniversaries, not with ceremonies or photographs, with maintenance. On a machine's round number year, he went through it comprehensively, checked everything he could check, replaced what was due for replacement, documented the current condition. It was his way of honoring the machine without being sentimental about it. The M's 40th year inspection, conducted over 3 evenings in his barn with the trouble light, produced a result that Dale noted in his columnar notebook with a satisfaction he didn't express to anyone. The engine compression was still within the original service specification. Not dramatically, it was at the low end of acceptable, as you'd expect from an engine with 40 years and uncounted hours. But within specification, the hydraulic system was working correctly. The transmission had been rebuilt once, in 1971, and had not required internal work since. The front axle was solid. The sheet metal was showing its age, as you'd expect, but the structural metal, the frame, the castings, was sound. He noted in the columnar notebook, M, 40 Wurzerzers, engine compression acceptable, all systems functional, no immediate requirements. He sat in the barn for a while after he wrote that. 40 years old. His father had bought it new. He had farmed it for the better part of 3 decades. It had never cost him a payment. It had never required a dealership service call. It had never needed a diagnosis he couldn't provide himself. Every time it had needed something, he had provided the something, with his hands and his knowledge and parts that were even now available through the supplier network for classic IH equipment that had developed as the collector market grew. He went inside and told Loretta that the M was going to be fine for another decade. Loretta said that was good. She was putting up beans. Part 8. The Return to Wapakoneta. In 1996, 22 years after the laugh at the parts counter, Dale Mossberger drove back into the John Deere dealership in Wapakoneta. The service department had reopened under new management, he'd heard. Different owner, different structure. He needed a specific hydraulic fitting for a piece of rented equipment he was using, a newer machine that actually required the dealership for parts, and this was the closest dealer. The dealership was different than he remembered, larger actually. They'd expanded the building and the lot, added a line of small utility tractors and zero-turn mowers that hadn't existed as a product category in 1974. The parts counter was staffed by 2 people. He didn't recognize either of them. He got the hydraulic fitting. While he was waiting for it to be pulled from inventory, the parts man made the same kind of dealership conversation that Kessler had made in 1974, friendly, professional, with the standard inquiry about what he was running. Dale told him, 3 Farmalls and a 1206. All paid for. The parts man was maybe 28, the age that Kessler might have been in 1974. He didn't laugh. He said, "Those old IH machines, the M especially, those are getting to be real money on the collector market. You see what a nice M is going for at auction?" Dale said he'd seen some numbers. "You thinking about selling any of them?" Dale said he wasn't. The parts man said that was fair, that a machine you know how to run and know how to fix was worth more to you than the market price generally. He said it with the easy certainty of a 28-year-old who had arrived at the correct conclusion through insufficient experience but had still arrived there. Dale paid for the fitting and walked out. He sat in his truck. 22 years. The same parking lot. The M, the 560, the 300, and now the 1206, all at home in his barn. No payment owed on any of them. The last note he'd carried on equipment had been a small operating line in 1969 that he'd paid off before the following season. He thought about Kessler's laugh. He thought about the fact that by now he'd saved, by his rough estimate, somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 in equipment financing costs since 1974. The accumulated difference between what he'd spent on the Farmalls and what he'd have spent on financed replacement equipment in the same period. He'd turned most of that difference into ground, the way he always turned money into ground when ground was available at a reasonable price. He was farming 230 acres now, all of it paid for, with a farm account that didn't owe anyone anything significant. He didn't tell anyone the $40,000 number. He wasn't sure of it precisely, and he wasn't the kind of man who shared rough estimates on important subjects. He filed it. He drove home. Part 9. Conversations at the End of the Lane. In the summer of 1998, Dale's neighbor to the north, a man named Breckenridge who had farmed beside him for nearly 30 years, stopped at the end of Dale's lane one evening while Dale was checking the fence along the road. They talked, the way neighboring farmers talk at fence lines, about the crop and the weather and the price of beans. Then Breckenridge said, "You remember when you kept those old Farmalls when everybody was going to the 40-20? Dale said he remembered. "You know what my total equipment debt was in 1982? Breckenridge asked. Dale said he hadn't known. Breckenridge told him a number. It was a number that Dale knew, from having watched Breckenridge's operation over 3 decades, had come very close to ending the farm. Breckenridge had survived the early 80s, barely, and had spent the better part of 10 years digging out from under the equipment debt that the low prices and high interest rates of 1982 and 1983 had turned from manageable to catastrophic. "I used to think you were behind the times," Breckenridge said. He said it without embarrassment, the way a man states a fact about his own past thinking when he's arrived at a different place. "Running those old machines while everybody else was in the new equipment." Dale kept checking the fence post he'd been checking. "The thing is," Breckenridge said, "you weren't behind the times. You were just running different numbers than the rest of us." Dale said that was about right. They stood at the fence for a while in the summer evening. The fields were coming in well on both sides of the fence line. Breckenridge's operation had recovered and was solid now. He'd rebuilt it over 15 hard years, the way good farmers rebuild things, steadily and without drama. Dale's operation had never needed rebuilding. "If you had to give me one thing," Breckenridge said, "one thing you did different, what would it be?" Dale thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things worth thinking about. "I never let someone else's numbers replace my own," he said. Kessler had good reasons for the 4230. From his position, behind that counter, the 4230 made complete sense. But it was his numbers, not mine. My numbers said something different. Breckenridge nodded. "What did your numbers say?" Dale said. "They said 3 paid-for machines that I can fix myself cost less every year than 1 financed machine that needs the dealer when it breaks. Every year that stayed true. It's still true." Breckenridge was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Simple." Dale said, "Simple doesn't mean easy." Breckenridge drove home. Dale finished checking the fence. The fields on both sides stretched out in the evening light, the corn coming in straight and even, the beans behind it the particular shade of green they get in a good year. He walked back to the barn. Part 10. The Farmalls in 2005. In 2005, Dale Mossberger was 72 years old and had been farming the same Auglaize County ground for 50 years. The M was 55 years old. The 560 was 42. The 300 was 50. The 1206 was 38. All four were still in the barn. All four still ran. His son, Randy, had been farming alongside him since 1991, learning the operation from the ground the way operations are actually learned. Not from textbooks, though textbooks have their place, but from the particular education of doing and watching and asking and making small mistakes with someone present to catch them before they become large mistakes. Randy was 41 in 2005. He had, under his father's supervision and then his own, maintained all four machines. He had also, in 2003, found that the collector market the young parts man had mentioned in 1996 had continued to develop to a point where the M, a 1950 Farmall M in good working condition, with documented maintenance history going back to the original purchase, was worth more than a parts man's passing comment would have suggested. He'd mentioned this to his father. Dale had listened. He'd said he wasn't surprised. He'd said the machines would be sold when there was a good reason to sell them and not before, and until then they were working equipment and their market value was less important than their operational value. Randy had accepted this. He understood the logic. He ran the M himself now for the lighter work, the same jobs it had done for 50 years, and he maintained it the way his father had maintained it, with attention and consistency and the particular respect that working things deserve. The 4230 that Kessler had been so confident about in 1974, the specific machine, the current year model that had been on the lot that day, would have been 31 years old by 2005. Most of those machines were gone by then, one way or another, traded in, worn out, parted out. The ones in good condition had their own collector value, which was a fact that would have surprised Kessler considerably. But Dale's Farmalls were still working, not collected, not preserved, working. Doing the jobs they'd always done, on the same ground they'd always done them on, maintained by the same family that had always maintained them. That was the distinction Dale had always made and never quite put into words. The difference between a machine that is preserved and a machine that is used. The Farmalls were not yet in the first category. They were still firmly in the second. When and if that changed, it would be on his terms and Randy's terms, based on what made sense for the farm, not on someone else's laugh. Part 11. What happened? When the dealer came back in 2001, a John Deere sales representative, third generation of them Dale thought since Kessler, drove out to the Mossberger farm to introduce himself and offer the updated equipment lineup. It was a standard territory call. The representative was in his early 30s, professional, knowledgeable, well-prepared. He saw the Farmalls in the yard. He was too professional to laugh. He asked, politely, whether Dale had considered updating his primary field equipment. He had brochures for the current large-frame Deere line. He had financing options. He had trade-in programs. Dale said he'd think about it. The representative said he'd follow up. Dale said there was no need. He wasn't rude about it. He was precise about it, which is a different thing. He thanked the young man for coming out, said he appreciated the information, and told him honestly that he was satisfied with what he was running and didn't expect that to change. The representative left. He pulled down the lane the way everyone pulled down the lane. Dale watched from the barn and turned onto the county road and disappeared. Randy, who had watched the exchange from the equipment shed, came over and said, "You enjoy that?" Dale said, "I don't enjoy it. I just know my numbers." Randy laughed, the laugh that children make when they've heard the punchline before and still find it satisfying. Epilogue. The numbers, end of account. Dale Mossberger retired from active farming in 2007 at age 74. Randy took over the full operation. The farm was, by that point, 241 acres, all of it paid for. The equipment debt total in the farm's history, going back to the M his father bought new in 1950, traceable in the columnar notebooks and not large. The M was still in the barn, 57 years old, still started, still ran. Randy farms it occasionally for the lighter work, the way his father did and his grandfather did before that. He maintains it with the same attention. He knows every system on it by feel, the way you know something you've maintained for years, and he can diagnose a problem on it before the symptoms get serious, because he is paying the kind of attention that the machine's age requires and that his family has been paying since 1950. He is not sentimental about it. Neither was his father. Sentiment is one thing, and judgment is another, and the Mossberger family has always been clearer on the distinction than most. The John Deere dealership in Wapakoneta is still there. Different ownership, different staff, different building than the one Dale walked into in 1974. They sell good equipment. They service it well. There is nothing wrong with what they sell. The laugh happened once, a long time ago, in a parts department that no longer exists, made by a man who was doing his job and had good reasons for his opinion. Dale never told anyone that the laugh had bothered him, because it hadn't exactly. What it had done was clarify something he'd already believed, that other people's assessments of your decisions are based on their numbers and their position and their experience, and those are not your numbers and your position and your experience, and the conclusions they arrive at have only as much relevance to your situation as the inputs they're working from. Kessler was working from the dealership's inputs. The dealership's inputs said, finance the 4230. From those inputs, from that position, that was the correct conclusion. Dale was working from the farm's inputs. The farm's input said, run the paid-for Farmalls. From those inputs, from that position, that was the correct conclusion. Both men were right, given their numbers. Only one of them had to live with the results. The M starts in the morning. Randy checks the oil before he takes it out. Some habits outlast the men who started them. In Chapter Expansion. Part 1. Continuation. Understanding the ground. To understand Dale Mossberger's numbers, you have to understand the ground he was working with, and to understand the ground you have to go back further than 1974. The Mossberger farm in Auglaize County, Ohio, sat on what geologists call the Bluffton Moraine, a belt of glacially deposited soil running across west-central Ohio that produces some of the flattest, most fertile cropland in the eastern United States. The soil profile runs deep. The drainage had been improved by tile laid in the 1920s by Dale's grandfather, and the combination of soil quality and drainage meant that the ground responded reliably to good management, with yields that didn't require heroic equipment expenditure to achieve. It was good ground, and good ground could be farmed profitably with modest equipment if the equipment was appropriate to the scale. This was the fundamental calculation that Kessler, standing behind the parts counter in Wapakoneta in 1974, did not have access to. He knew equipment, he knew financing terms, he knew horsepower to acres ratios and the general principle that larger equipment operated at lower cost per acre on larger operations. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know standing behind the counter, was the specific relationship between this particular piece of ground and the equipment required to work it at this particular scale. Dale had been watching that relationship his entire farming life. He'd watched his father work it. He'd watched his grandfather work it before that. He knew, from 3 generations of observation, what the ground needed and what it didn't need. He knew that the 560 had more than enough horsepower for the primary field work on 118 flat acres. He knew that the M handled the secondary work without strain. He knew that the combination of 3 well-maintained paid-for machines performed every task the farm required at a cost per season that was substantially below what any financed replacement would cost. He had run those numbers on the back of a grain elevator receipt in the fall of 1973, a year before the Kessler conversation. He'd run them again in the fall of 1974 after the conversation to confirm that the laugh had not introduced an error he'd missed. The numbers had not changed. Running your own numbers. That was the discipline. Not hostile to the dealership's numbers, not dismissive of them. They were real numbers with real sources. But not substituting them for your own numbers without checking whether they applied to your specific situation. Expansion. Part 2. Continuation. The specific economics of 1974. The 1974 equipment market in Auglaize County, Ohio, deserves specific attention because the general picture is not the same as the specific one. The John Deere 4230, which Kessler was presenting as the solution, had been introduced in 1973 as part of the Generation 2 line. It was a 122 horsepower tractor in standard configuration, available with a sound guard cab that represented the current state-of-the-art in operator comfort, with a quad-range transmission that gave 16 forward speeds in a synchronized package that was genuinely excellent. It was a real improvement over what had come before it in terms of capability and ergonomics. The list price in 1974 was in the range of $22,000 to $25,000 depending on configuration, which at the financing rates of that period, which were not yet the catastrophic rates of the early 80s but were not negligible, produced a monthly payment that translated over 7 years to a total cost substantially higher than the list price. Dale had done the math. The 4230 at full cost over 7 years of financing, including interest, represented approximately $30,000 out of his operation. $30,000 that did not exist in his expenses without the purchase. Against this, what were the Farmalls actually costing him annually? He tracked this precisely. Parts, fluids, occasional outside service on the few jobs requiring specialized equipment. The year before the Kessler conversation, 1973, the total was $61.20. Not a typo. $61. His operation ran well enough and he knew the machines well enough that the annual maintenance cost on 3 tractors was $61. It would not always be that low. The EMS valve job the following year cost $68 in parts. The 560 hydraulic pump cost $112. Over any given decade, the number averaged perhaps $80 to $100 per year in a typical year, with occasional spike years in the $150 to $200 range when something required more work. Against $30,000 over 7 years, roughly $4,000 annually in financing cost alone. The Farmall maintenance number was in a different category entirely. The difference between $4,300 a year in total equipment cost and $60 a year in total equipment cost, invested or retained in the farm account over 20 years, was the difference between a farm that grew and a farm that was perpetually catching up to its own overhead. Kessler's numbers were not wrong. For an operation at the scale where a 4230 was the appropriate machine, larger acreage, where the efficiency gains of greater horsepower actually reduced cost per acre sufficiently to offset the financing, the Kessler analysis made sense. For Dale's 118 acres of flat Ohio tile drained ground, it did not. Scale matters. The right answer for one operation is the wrong answer for another. The dealer's job is to sell equipment, and selling equipment from a position of genuine belief in its value is not dishonest. The farmer's job is to buy what fits his specific operation. The laugh came from a place where those two jobs were not in alignment, and neither man was wrong within his own frame of reference. Expansion, Part 4. Continuation, the crisis. Years in detail. The farm crisis of the early 1980s came to Auglaize County the way it came to every farming county in the Midwest, through the combination of expanded debt, falling commodity prices, and the Federal Reserve's inflation-fighting interest rate policy that pushed prime rates above 20% in 1981 before beginning its long retreat. Dale watched it from a position he had not specifically engineered for the crisis, but which turned out to be well suited to surviving it. He had no equipment notes. His operating line was modest. He borrowed seasonally for seed and chemicals and repaid it at harvest, the way a well-managed farm borrows operating money. And his land was not leveraged. He had bought everything with cash or had inherited it, and the cash had come from years of lower costs than his neighbors, which had produced the savings that made the cash purchases possible. His neighbor Breckenridge had equipment debt when the crisis hit. He had land debt too. He'd bought 40 acres in 1979 at the peak land prices using a variable rate loan, and when the rates moved in 1981 and 1982, the payment on that loan went to a number that the farm's income in those years could not service without strain. He restructured with the bank, sold some equipment at the worst possible time, cut every cost he could find, and survived. Barely. He told Dale years later that 1983 had been the year he genuinely didn't know if they'd make it. Another neighbor, farther down the county road, did not make it. His operation was larger than Breckenridge's, and his debt was proportionally larger. He had 2 large Deere tractors, both on notes, land financed at variable rates on 2 separate parcels, and an operating line that had grown over the good years of the late 70s because the good years made the risk feel smaller than it was. When the prices fell and the rates went up, the combination was unworkable. He sold in 1984, not at his choosing, but at the bank's. The farm that his father had built and that he'd expanded through the 70s went to a larger operation that absorbed it the way large operations absorb distressed farms, efficiently and without sentiment. Dale drove past that farm on the county road for the next 20 years. He noted it each time without comment. What he took from those years was not the satisfaction of having been right. He had not been trying to be right. He had been trying to run a farm that worked. And being right was a byproduct of that effort rather than the goal. What he took from the crisis years was a confirmation of the principle he'd been operating on since before he could have articulated it. The farm that costs less to run survives longer, and the largest controllable element of what a farm costs to run is the financing structure on the equipment and land. Remove the financing, and you remove the variable that turns a manageable downturn into a crisis. The crop prices fall for everyone. The interest rates rise for everyone. The equipment keeps working for the man who owns it free and clear, and stops working, because it gets repossessed, for the man who doesn't. Dale had owned his equipment free and clear since before the crisis. The M had been paid for the day his father died and left it to him. The 560 had been paid for when he bought it used in 1968. The 300 had been paid for. None of them had ever had a bank's name on the title alongside the Mossberger name. That was, in the final analysis, the whole decision. Who owns it? The machine that belongs to the bank is working for the bank. The machine that belongs to the farmer is working for the farmer. The distinction seems obvious stated plainly, and it is obvious. It just turns out that many perfectly intelligent people find ways to lose sight of it in the context of a shiny showroom and a favorable interest rate and a salesman's confident enthusiasm. Expansion. Part 5. Continuation. Keeping the knowledge. There is an aspect of running old equipment that gets discussed less often than the economic arguments, but which Dale considered equally important. When you run equipment, you can fix yourself. You keep knowledge. When you replace it with equipment that requires a dealer's diagnostic computer, you give up knowledge. This sounds abstract until you are standing in a field at 7 in the morning with a machine that won't run and planting 3 days behind because the rain came when it shouldn't have and you cannot afford another delay. At that moment, the question of whether you can diagnose and fix the problem yourself or whether you need to call the dealer and wait for a service window is not abstract at all. It is the most practical question in your life. Dale could diagnose and fix the M and the 560 and the 300 and later the 1206 in the field with the tools in his truck without a phone call. Not for every possible failure. Some things require a shop. But for the range of failures that actually occur to well-maintained equipment, which is narrower than people think, he could handle himself. He knew the fuel systems because he'd cleaned and rebuilt them. He knew the hydraulic systems because he'd repaired and adjusted them. He knew the electrical systems because he'd replaced components and traced circuits. He knew the clutches and the transmissions because he'd adjusted and rebuilt them. This knowledge had been acquired, piece by piece, over 30 years of maintaining the machines. It was not free. It had cost time, and the occasional frustration of a job that took longer than expected and produced results that required a second attempt. But once acquired, it was there. Durable, portable, available at 7 in the morning in the field with no cell service and planting 3 days behind. The 4230 that Kessler had been selling in 1974 was not yet the computer-dependent machine that its successors became. The major electronic management systems came in later as the 80s and 90s progressed. But even in 1974, the trend was clear to someone paying attention. Each generation of equipment was more capable and more dependent on manufacturer support than the one before. Dale had seen enough of the trajectory to project where it was going. He wasn't a Luddite. He didn't object to the machines. He objected to the dependency, and specifically to the dependency in the context of his 100-and-some-acre operation, where the capital required to own them was out of proportion to the efficiency gains they offered. For his scale, with his skill set on his ground, the old iron was the right answer. He knew this and acted on it and declined to be embarrassed by it when Kessler laughed. Expansion. Part 9. Continuation. Randy's understanding. Randy Mossberger grew up with the Farmalls the way farm kids grow up with the equipment on their place, not noticing them specifically, just knowing them as part of the background of daily life. The M had been running his whole life. The 560 had been running since before he was born. The 1206 had arrived when he was 21, and he'd been there when his father paid cash for it at the Salina dispersal sale, and he remembered the particular expression on the selling agent's face, a slight surprise, quickly suppressed, when Dale produced a check rather than asking about financing. He'd learned to drive on the M, which is where most of the farm kids in that part of Ohio learned to drive in those years. He'd learned to check the oil and grease the fittings, and read the color of the exhaust smoke and listen to the engine when it changed pitch. He'd learned from his father the specific vocabulary of what the machine sounded like when they were right and what they sounded like when they weren't. And the gap between those two sounds was where a farmer lived and where attentive listening saved you money. When he took over the primary management of the operation in the early 2000s, he continued his father's maintenance practices without modification, not because he was required to, but because they worked, and things that work deserve continuation until there is a clear reason to change them. He kept the columnar notebooks the way his father had. He documented the maintenance work. He tracked the costs. The numbers continued to do what the numbers had always done. Confirmed that paid-for iron maintained correctly cost less than financed iron replaced on a schedule. He had a conversation with his father in 2004 that he still thinks about. He had been at a farm show and had seen the current large-frame deer line. The technology had advanced considerably since 1974. GPS guidance, yield monitoring, the full precision agriculture stack that the major manufacturers were rolling out in the mid-2000s. He was not unimpressed. He came home and told his father what he'd seen. His father listened to the description of the technology. He asked a few questions, practical questions about reliability and field adaptability, not hostile questions but genuine ones. Then he said, "What does your operation need that it doesn't have?" Randy thought about it honestly. He needed to be honest because his father would know if he wasn't. "The yield mapping would be useful," he said. "I think there's variability in the south field that we're not capturing." His father said, "Can you address the variability without the machine?" Randy said he thought he could, with better soil sampling on a finer grid and a willingness to apply variable rates manually based on the soil data. His father said, "So the question is whether the yield gain justifies the cost of the equipment to achieve it, or whether you can get most of the yield gain at lower cost another way." Randy said yes, that was the question. His father said, "Run the numbers." Randy ran the numbers. The numbers said that a targeted soil sampling program and manual variable rate application, scaled to his operation, produced a cost per acre improvement comparable to the yield mapping system at a fraction of the capital cost. He implemented the soil sampling program. He kept the Farmalls. He told his father the result. His father nodded. He didn't say he'd known. He'd asked because he wanted Randy to find out. That was, Randy understood the inheritance. Not the tractors. Tractors were iron. They'd be replaced eventually. Even the M would eventually give way to something when the M reached the point where its maintenance cost exceeded its operational value. The inheritance was the method. The discipline of running your own numbers. The refusal to substitute someone else's conclusion for your own analysis. The willingness to look quiet and unfashionable in front of a parts counter and drive home in your truck and go back to the barn and do the math. The laugh doesn't change the math. That was what Randy had been given, wrapped in 4 tractors and 50 years of columnar notebooks and a farm that had never, in its entire operational history, been repossessed. Expansion. Part 3. Continuation. The specific work of staying. The work of maintaining an old machine over decades is not the work most people imagine when they hear the phrase, "kept the old tractors running." It sounds simple stated that way. The reality is a sustained, active discipline that requires both knowledge and organization. Dale kept a separate maintenance log for each of the 4 tractors, a small spiral notebook for each machine, stored on a shelf in the barn, updated after every maintenance event. The M's log went back to 1962, when he'd started keeping it after inheriting the farm. The pages from the 60s were faded and oil-stained at the edges from barn use. The entries were brief and precise: date, what was done, parts used and cost, hours on the machine if known. Reading the M's log from front to back was reading the biography of a working machine. The valve job in 1975, the clutch adjustment in 1976 and again in 1981, the carburetor jet cleaning in 1977 and the carburetor rebuild in 1984 when the jet cleaning was no longer sufficient, the front wheel bearing replacement in 1980. The magneto points, done annually until 1983 when he converted it to electronic ignition with a kit that cost $42 and eliminated the annual points replacement entirely. The rear seal in 1988, a job he'd been putting off for 2 years and finally did on a rainy week in March. The radiator hose set in 1991, replaced preventively because they were original and 31 years was long enough. Each entry was 10 to 20 words. The complete log for 30 years of maintenance was 32 pages in a 50-page spiral notebook. The other 18 pages were blank. This economy of record-keeping matched the economy of the maintenance itself. He didn't do work that didn't need doing. He didn't replace parts that had life remaining. He didn't panic at the first sign of wear and pull a machine apart when adjustment would serve. He applied the minimum necessary intervention to maintain the machine in working condition, documented it precisely, and moved on. The log also served as a diagnostic resource. When a symptom appeared on a machine, a new sound, a new behavior, a performance change, he could look at the maintenance history and see when relevant systems had last been serviced, what had been done and what hadn't, and use that history to narrow the probable cause. The machine's history was available to inform the diagnosis. A machine you've been maintaining for 30 years tells you things a new machine doesn't, because you know its baseline and you can see what has changed. This was the part of old iron farming that couldn't be reduced to an economics argument, the part that Kessler's analysis couldn't capture. The knowledge that had accumulated in Dale's hands and his notebooks over 30 years was worth something that didn't appear in the comparison between the 4230's price and the Farmalls maintenance cost. It was worth the ability to fix his own problems, in his own barn, on his own schedule, with his own hands, without a service window, without a diagnostic fee, without the particular helplessness of a man who owns a machine he cannot fix. That was, Dale would have said, the real argument against the 4230 in 1974. Not just the numbers, the knowledge. You can't maintain what you can't understand. And understanding comes from time and attention, and the particular intimacy of maintaining something through every season it encounters, watching it age, learning its tendencies. He had 30 years of that with the Farmalls by the time Kessler laughed. He was not going to trade it for a payment book. The M starts in the morning. Randy checks the oil. The notebooks go back to 1962. The numbers have always said the same thing. Some men listened to them, and some men listened to someone else. The farms that are still here tell you which choice aged better.